The year was 1947, in a high valley just south of the Alaska Range. Men who had come back from the war were trying to build new lives from scratch on land that was both beautiful and brutal. In the late summer sun, Arvid Nilsson was doing something that made no sense. He was digging, not for a root cellar, not for a well, but a massive rectangular pit, far larger than the foundation of any log cabin needed to be. He worked alone, his movements precise and economical. While other men were felling timber, notching logs with practiced swings of the axe, Arvid was moving earth. He used a simple spade and a wheelbarrow, and the pile of dark soil beside the hole grew day by day. His neighbors would stop their wagons on the track that passed his claim, watching him for a moment. They saw the strange metal ribs laid out on the grass, curved sections of corrugated steel that shimmered in the light. They were the bones of a Quonset hut, war surplus he had hauled up from Anchorage at great expense. The valley's undisputed master builder, a man named Silas Croft, had stopped by once. He had looked at the deep pit, then at the curved steel sheets. He had shaken his head slowly. He told Arvid, as he told others at the trading post later, that the man was building a tomb. The community agreed. They watched the strange Swede toil on his project, and they gave it a name. They called it Nilsson's Tin Can. They believed he was a fool, an outsider, who did not understand the unforgiving physics of an Alaskan winter. But what did this quiet former combat engineer, a man who had survived the Arctic convoys and fought in the frozen forests of Norway, understand about cold that every experienced frontiersman in the valley had missed? This story is about more than just a strange building. It's about how an unconventional idea, born from hard-won experience, can defy the strongest traditions. If you believe in the power of quiet innovation, hit that subscribe button right now and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. The answer to that question would be written not in words, but in ice and fire, and in the survival of his family against impossible odds. To understand Arvid's madness, you must first understand the cold, not the crisp, clean cold of a clear winter morning, but the deep, predatory cold of the Alaskan interior. It was a physical presence. It was a force that leached the life from everything it touched. Winter in that valley was not a season. It was a siege. It began in October and did not release its grip until May. The enemy was simple: heat loss. A house was a tiny vessel of warmth in an infinite ocean of cold. The cold attacked in two ways. First, through conduction. It seeped through logs, through chinking, through the very ground itself. Every surface of a cabin, walls, floor, ceiling, was a potential breach. Families stuffed moss, mud, and even old rags into the gaps between logs, a constant, losing battle against the infiltration of drafts that felt like razors on the skin. The second attack was through convection. Every time the stove was fed, the fire consumed vast amounts of air. This air had to come from somewhere. In a tightly sealed cabin, it would create a vacuum, choking the fire and filling the room with smoke. So, the fire drew its breath from the outside, pulling frigid air in through every tiny crack and crevice. This meant that the very act of creating heat was simultaneously introducing more cold into the house. It was a paradox that consumed firewood at a terrifying rate. The conventional wisdom, perfected over generations, was to build with mass. The solution was the log cabin, a fortress of timber. A good cabin, one built by Silas Croft, had walls of spruce logs a foot thick. It had a deep stone foundation and a heavy sod roof. These homes were monuments to tradition, symbols of resilience. They were the best defense anyone in that valley had ever known, but they were failing. Not catastrophically, but in a slow, grinding way that wore families down. The inside walls of even the best cabins would be coated in a fine layer of frost on the coldest nights. A bucket of water left too far from the stove would freeze solid by morning. Children were bundled in layers of wool even indoors, their breath pluming in the air of the loft where they slept. Life contracted to a small circle of survivable space around the cast-iron stove. The cost was measured in firewood. A family needed to cut, split, and stack at least 12 cords of wood to survive the winter. It was a summer's worth of back-breaking labor for a winter's worth of tenuous warmth. During a cold snap, a family could burn through a quarter of a cord in a single day. Running out of wood was not an inconvenience. It was a death sentence. Arvid Nilsson had seen this suffering during his first winter in a small, borrowed cabin. He had watched his wife, Ilara, constantly tending the fire, her face perpetually flushed on one side and chilled on the other. He had felt the drafts that snaked across the floor, chilling the feet of his two small children, Lars and Freya. He had lain awake at night listening to the house creak and groan as the frost deepened its hold, the sound of a ship being slowly crushed by pack ice. His background gave him a different lens through which to see the problem. He was not a homesteader, he was an engineer. In the war, he hadn't built shelters for comfort. He had built them for survival under extreme conditions where efficiency was paramount. He had learned that fighting the cold with brute force, with thicker walls and bigger fires, was a battle of attrition you would eventually lose. The cold had infinite resources. You had a woodpile. He knew the ground itself held a secret. 6 feet below the surface, the earth was not warm, but it was stable. While the air temperature could swing 100 degrees, the deep ground in that valley held a near constant temperature of around 40 degrees Fahrenheit. To a man freezing in a negative 40-degree wind, 40 degrees was a form of salvation. The local cabins fought the ground, trying to insulate themselves from it with stone foundations. Arvid planned to do the opposite. He planned to make an alliance with it. This was the why behind the enormous pit. He was not just building a foundation, he was building an engine, a passive, subterranean engine designed to precondition the very air his family would breathe. The Quonset hut was not a choice of desperation. It was a choice of engineering. A log cabin was a collection of countless joints and seams, each a potential leak. The metal shell of the Quonset, when assembled, would be a nearly perfect, airtight vessel. He wasn't building a house, he was building a thermos. His build began not with walls, but with ducts. At the bottom of his 10-foot deep pit, he laid a network of wide-diameter metal pipes, salvaged from the same military surplus yard as the hut. One long pipe ran from the bottom of the pit, extending 100 feet away from the house, where it would eventually surface with a hooded vent to keep out snow. This was the intake, the lung. Over these pipes, he poured a 2-foot-thick layer of coarse gravel. This was the heat exchanger. Then he built a thick, insulated concrete retaining wall around the perimeter of the pit. He poured a concrete floor over the gravel bed, embedding another set of ducts within the slab itself. These ducts would route the air from the subterranean plenum to a single point, a sealed chamber directly beneath where his wood stove would one day sit. Silas Croft came by again when Arvid was pouring the concrete. He was the valley's expert, a man whose opinion carried the weight of proven success. He had built more than half the homes in the area, and none had ever been lost to winter. He wasn't a malicious man. He was genuinely concerned. He saw Arvid's strange preparations as the height of folly. "Arvid," Silas said, his voice laced with the patience one uses for a stubborn child, "that ground is frozen solid 8 feet deep in the winter. Your fancy pipes will just fill with ice. You're building a cold sink, not a heat source." Arvid paused, wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand. He looked at the respected builder, a man he knew was trying to help. "The ground is not frozen at 10 feet, Arvid said simply. And the air will be moving? Silas shook his head, gesturing at the curved steel panels. And this tin shell? The moment you light a fire in there, every drop of moisture from your breath, from cooking, from washing, is going to condense on that cold metal. It will rain inside your own house. The insulation you put in will be a sodden, frozen mass. It won't work, son. It's against nature. Arvid just nodded. I am trying to keep my family warm, he replied, and turned back to his work. The conversation was over. Silas left, convinced more than ever that the Nilsson family would be a tragic headline in the territorial newspaper before the spring thaw. The story of this exchange spread quickly. It solidified the community's opinion. Arvid wasn't just eccentric, he was endangering his wife and children. The mockery at the trading post became tinged with a grim sort of pity. Nilsson's Folly was one name for it. The icebox was another. His project was a spectacle. Men would drive by slowly, pointing out the strange, deep foundation and the growing metal arch. It looked alien, an object dropped from the sky into a landscape of timber and stone. Once the concrete cured, Arvid began erecting the Quonset's steel ribs. He bolted them together with relentless precision, Alara helping him wrench the nuts tight. Then came the corrugated skin, each sheet overlapping the next, sealed with a tar-like mastic. From the outside, it was just a half-cylinder of raw metal, brutally utilitarian and starkly ugly against the backdrop of spruce and aspen. But the real work, the secret to the whole system, was happening on the inside. Arvid began framing a second, interior structure within the hut. He built a traditional wooden frame for walls and a ceiling. But he left a full 8-inch gap between his new interior walls and the outer metal skin. This was the critical air gap, a buffer zone between the living space and the frigid steel. He then began to fill this cavity. He used the cheapest, most plentiful insulation available, sawdust and wood shavings collected for free from the local sawmill. The community saw this as yet another sign of his madness. Sawdust was known to settle, to absorb moisture, to become a useless, frozen clump. But they didn't see the care with which Arvid was packing it, ensuring a uniform density. They didn't see that his airtight outer shell and interior vapor barrier of tar paper were designed to prevent the very moisture that made sawdust fail in a conventional log home. He built the floor last, a thick wooden tongue and groove surface laid over the concrete slab. It was insulated from the concrete by a layer of cork. The only thing that broke the clean interior lines was the stove, a small but efficient cast iron box stove. It sat on a brick hearth, and directly beneath it was a grated vent set into the floor. This was the terminus of his subterranean engine. By late September, as the first snows dusted the high peaks, the system was complete. From the outside, it was an ugly, metal half-pipe sitting in a field of dirt. Inside, it was a clean, simple space of unfinished wood. Arvid explained the system to Alara one evening, sketching it on a piece of scrap lumber. He had built a lung beneath the house. The cold, dense winter air, sometimes 50 degrees below zero, would be drawn into the intake pipe 100 feet away. As it traveled through the buried pipe and into the gravel plenum 10 feet underground, it would be forced to warm up. The 40-degree earth was a massive, stable heat source compared to the dangerously cold air. The air would not become warm, but it would be tempered, stripped of its lethal edge. It might enter the plenum at -50 and leave it at +20 degrees. This tempered air would then travel up through the ducts in the concrete slab, warming a little more, before entering the stove's dedicated air intake vent in the floor. The stove would now be breathing pre-warmed, 20-degree air instead of -50-degree air. This meant the fire would burn hotter and more completely, extracting more energy from every piece of wood. Crucially, Because the stove had its own dedicated sealed air supply, it would no longer suck the warm air out of the living space. The cabin would no longer be fighting itself. The heat he generated would stay inside, trapped by the thick layer of sawdust insulation and the insulating air gap. The airtight metal shell, once a liability in the eyes of his neighbors, was now his greatest asset. It was the seal on his thermos. He had created a closed system. It was an elegant piece of thermal engineering disguised as a crude metal shed. But as the days grew shorter and the temperature began its relentless slide towards zero, no one saw the elegance. They only saw the folly. They saw a man who had rejected generations of wisdom in favor of a strange, ugly machine. They waited for the winter to teach him his lesson. Then December came. It arrived not with a gentle dusting of snow, but with a roar. An Arctic high-pressure system, a vast, dense mass of unimaginably cold air, broke free from the polar cap and slid down across Alaska. The old-timers called it an Arctic Express. It was a once-in-a-generation weather event. The temperature at dawn on the 1st of December was 14 degrees Fahrenheit, cold but manageable. By sunset, the thermometer on the porch of the trading post read -4. By midnight, it was -21. And it kept dropping. The wind picked up, a dry, scouring gale that found every crack in every cabin. The air itself felt thin and sharp in the lungs. For the first few days, the community hunkered down, confident in their thick log walls and well-stocked woodsheds. This was what they had prepared for. But the cold did not relent. It deepened. -25. -35. The official reading from the radio station in Fairbanks reported -48. In the high valleys, it was even colder. The community began to suffer. The fortress-like log cabins were failing under the sustained assault. The immense thermal mass of the logs, normally a source of stability, was now completely saturated with cold. The logs were no longer insulators. They were conductors, pulling heat out of the homes as fast as the stoves could produce it. The first sign of catastrophic failure was the wood consumption. Families who had budgeted a cord of wood for the entire month of December were burning through it in a week. The sound of axes splitting wood became a constant, desperate drumbeat in the frozen air, a sound that carried for miles. Men were forced to venture out into the brutal cold to cut more fuel, risking frostbite and exhaustion. Inside the homes, life became a grim ordeal. A rime of frost grew thick on the inside of the walls, sparkling in the lamplight. It crept across the window panes, obscuring the world in beautiful, deadly patterns. Ink froze in its wells. Potatoes stored in sacks on the floor turned to solid, icy lumps. The simple act of opening the door to throw out slop water was a violent event, letting in a swirling cloud of cold that would take an hour to fight back. Silas Croft, the master builder, was struggling as much as anyone. His own home, the pinnacle of his craft, felt like a sieve. He and his wife had abandoned their bedroom, moving a mattress onto the floor beside the massive stone fireplace in the main room. They kept the fire roaring day and night, a constant, hungry beast that consumed log after log. Still, the temperature inside the cabin hovered in the low 40s. His wife's hands were cracked and bleeding from the dry, cold air. His beard was often stiff with his own frozen breath. He was an expert, and his expertise was useless. He had done everything right, everything that tradition and experience had taught him. He had built a magnificent defense, but the enemy was simply too powerful. His certainty, the bedrock of his reputation, had become his prison. He was trapped in a cold box of his own making, burning through his future to survive the present. On the 10th day of the freeze, the temperature bottomed out at a terrifying 52 degrees below zero. The wind howled, driving the effective temperature into the realm of the truly unsurvivable. That morning, news trickled through the valley. The Miller family's cabin, a smaller, older structure on the far side of the creek, had been abandoned. They had run out of wood and made a desperate trek to their nearest neighbor in the middle of the night, suffering severe frostbite. Their livestock had frozen to death in the barn. 14 homes in the wider region would be lost before the cold broke. This was no longer a hardship. It was a disaster. And in the back of Silas Croft's mind, a nagging, terrible thought began to grow. He thought of the quiet Swede, Arvid Nilsson. He thought of his wife and his 2 small children. He thought of the ugly metal hut, the structure he had publicly declared a death trap. He imagined the thin metal walls conducting the lethal cold directly inside. He pictured the condensation he had predicted, the interior coated in a thick shell of ice. Guilt gnawed at him. He was the valley's leader, its expert. He had mocked the man, dismissed him. He had stood by and watched him build what was surely a coffin for his family. What if they were already gone? What if they had frozen quietly in their beds, too proud or too isolated to ask for help? The thought was unbearable. He had to know. He had to go and see for himself, to offer what little help he could, even if it was just bringing them back to his own cold, struggling home. Before the vindication, before the moment that would change everything for that small community, I have to ask you to do something. If you've ever felt like the outsider, the one with a crazy idea that no one else understood, then hit that like button right now. It tells the algorithm that stories of quiet persistence and ultimate triumph are worth sharing. Your click helps these forgotten histories find a new audience. Now let us follow Silas on his journey through the storm. The journey to Nilsson's claim was a battle. It was less than 2 miles, but in the biting wind and deep, crystalline snow, it felt like a polar expedition. Silas bundled himself in every layer of wool and fur he owned. He pulled a scarf over his face until only his eyes were exposed. The cold was so intense it felt like a physical blow, a pressure on his chest that made each breath a conscious effort. The moisture from his eyes froze instantly on his eyelashes. He walked because taking the horses out in this weather would kill them. The snow squeaked under his boots with a high, alien sound, the unique protest of crystals at 50 below. The world was stripped of all color, a brutalist landscape of white snow and black, skeletal trees under a pale, indifferent sun. He kept his head down, focusing on the next step, his mind filled with grim scenarios of what he would find. A silent, smoke-free chimney. A door drifted shut with snow. A terrible final stillness. As he crested the last rise, he saw it. Nilsson's tin can. It sat there, a dark curve against the white, looking small and utterly defeated by the vast, frozen landscape. But then he saw a thin, almost lazy plume of smoke rising from the metal chimney pipe. It wasn't the thick, panicked smoke of a fire being desperately fed. It was a steady, efficient wisp. He saw something else, too. The snow on the curved roof was not melted. It was lying thick and even, a perfect white blanket. In any other cabin, the escaping heat would have melted the snow near the chimney. This was his first clue that something was profoundly different. He reached the door, his face numb, his beard a solid mass of ice. He raised a gloved, clumsy hand and knocked. The sound was flat and dead in the cold air. He waited, expecting a long delay, a struggle with a frozen latch. Instead, the door swung open almost immediately, and Silas Croft was hit by a wave. It was not a wave of air. It was a wave of life. It was a physical force of warmth, laden with the impossible sense of baking bread, hot coffee, and seasoned wood. It struck his frozen face like a summer sun. He stumbled back a step, blinking in disbelief. Standing in the doorway was Arvid Nilsson. He was wearing simple wool trousers and a plain cotton shirt, its sleeves rolled to the elbows. There was no urgency in his eyes, no sign of strain or fear. He simply looked at Silas with calm curiosity. "Mr. Croft," he said, his voice even, "it is a cold day to be out walking." Silas was speechless. He couldn't reconcile the brutal reality of the world he had just walked through with the impossible sanctuary that lay beyond the threshold. He stepped inside, and Arvid closed the door, shutting out the howling wind and the crushing cold. The silence was absolute. The scene before him defied every law of nature as he understood it. The interior was bright and warm. Arvid's two children, Lars and Freya, were playing on the wooden floor. They were barefoot. Barefoot. In the middle of the worst freeze in living memory, Ilara Nilsson was at a simple wooden counter, kneading dough, her face glowing with a light sheen of perspiration. Steam rose from a kettle on the small stove. Silas's expert eyes began to investigate, trying to find the trick. He looked at the windows. They were simple, single-pane glass, yet there was not a single speck of frost on them. He could see the tormented, wind-blasted trees outside as clearly as if it were an autumn day. He looked at the walls, the simple wooden panels of the interior frame. He ran a bare hand over the north-facing wall, the one that should have been the coldest, the one that in his own home was a solid sheet of ice. It was warm, not just neutral, but actively, passively warm to the touch. He turned his attention to the source of the heat. The stove was a small, unassuming iron box, far smaller than his own massive fireplace. The fire within it was not a roaring inferno. It was a bed of glowing coals, burning with a quiet, steady intensity. A single, medium-sized log was all that was inside. It was impossible. A fire that small should have been extinguished by the cold of the room in minutes. Finally, his gaze fell upon the wood box. It was a simple crate against the wall. In his own home, a box that size would be emptied 3 or 4 times a day. This one was nearly full. His mind, the practical, calculating mind of a builder, began to spin. He looked at Arvid, his voice raspy and cracked from the cold. "How much wood have you burned?" Arvid considered the question for a moment. "Since the cold began? Perhaps half a cord," he said, his tone casual, as if discussing the weather on a mild day. The number landed on Silas Croft like a physical blow. Half a cord. In 10 days. He himself had burned through nearly 3 cords. He was burning wood at a rate 6 times greater than Nilsson, yet his house was a barely survivable icebox, while this place was a bubble of summer. The numbers were undeniable. They were absurd. They were revolutionary. He walked to the center of the room, feeling the even, radiant warmth on his skin. He could feel the circulation, a gentle, imperceptible movement of air, with no drafts, no cold spots near the floor. He looked down at the vent beneath the stove and finally understood. He looked at the warm walls and understood. He saw the whole system, the elegant, invisible engine, and he felt the foundations of his entire professional life crumble beneath him. Everything he knew, everything he had preached, everything he had built was wrong. He turned to Arvid Nilsson, the man he had pitied, the man the whole valley had mocked as a fool. The ice on his beard was beginning to melt, dripping onto the floor. He felt a profound sense of shame, followed by an overwhelming wave of awe. He looked the quiet engineer in the eye. "I was wrong," Silas Croft said, his voice thick with emotion. "Completely and utterly wrong. This works. Will you teach me how?" The great freeze broke 2 days later. The temperature climbed, agonizingly slowly, back toward 0. As the immediate threat to life receded, the community began to take stock of the devastation. They counted the lost livestock, the damaged homes, the families who had lost everything. And amidst the stories of hardship and near disaster, a new story began to circulate. It started with Silas Croft. He did not whisper it. He declared it. At the trading post, his voice booming through the small store, he told everyone what he had seen. He described the barefoot children, the warm walls, the full wood box. He used his own unimpeachable reputation as collateral, silencing the scoffers with the sheer force of his conviction. He described Nilsson's home not as a tin can, but as a miracle of engineering. He confessed his own ignorance, his own arrogance, with a humility that shocked everyone who heard it. The community was skeptical at first, but Silas was not a man given to exaggeration, and he was not alone. He began taking other men, the valley's most respected elders and builders, on trips to the Nilsson homestead. Each one made the same journey from disbelief to astonishment. They would enter the Quonset hut, their faces still raw from the lingering cold, and be met with the same impossible warmth. They would touch the walls, inspect the stove, and listen, rapt, as Arvid quietly explained the principles of his system. Replication began that very spring. Led by Silas Croft, who had become Arvid's most devoted student, a crew of men began excavating a deep pit on a new claim. Arvid shared his knowledge freely. He drew diagrams in the dirt, explained the importance of the vapor barrier, the correct depth for the earth tubes, the ideal density for packing the sawdust insulation. He sought no payment, no fame. His only goal had been to protect his family, and now he shared that protection with the community that had once scorned him. The Nilsson House, as it came to be called, became the new standard. The ugly Quonset hut was the prototype, but the principles were quickly adapted to more traditional structures. New log cabins were built not on shallow stone foundations, but over deep, insulated plenums. Builders learned to create a double wall structure, leaving a wide, insulated cavity. The idea of giving the stove its own dedicated pre-warmed air supply became gospel. The transformation of the valley was visible within a few years. The immense woodpiles that had once dominated every homestead began to shrink. The desperate, all-consuming labor of cutting firewood was reduced by more than half, freeing up time and energy for other tasks. Winter, while still a formidable opponent, was no longer a siege. It became a season to be endured, even enjoyed. The real impact wasn't measured in degrees on a thermometer or in cords of wood saved. It was measured in human lives. It was measured in the sharp decline in winter illnesses that had once plagued the children. It was measured in the security families felt, knowing they could withstand the worst the Arctic could throw at them. It was measured in the simple dignity of a family able to move freely in their own home, no longer tethered to the life-giving but tyrannical circle of the stove. Arvid Nilsson had not just built a better house. He had fundamentally changed the relationship between the people and the land. The story of Arvid Nilsson and his tin can is a powerful reminder. It teaches us that tradition, for all its accumulated wisdom, can sometimes become a cage, blinding us to new solutions. It shows that the most revolutionary ideas often come from the margins, from outsiders who see a problem with fresh eyes, unburdened by the dogma of how things have always been done. His solution was not born of high technology, but of a deep understanding of fundamental physics. He saw the forces of nature, conduction, convection, thermal mass, not as enemies to be fought, but as partners to be intelligently managed. The principles he used are alive today in modern passive house design, in geothermal heating systems, and in the science of building envelopes. He was decades ahead of his time, an intuitive engineer working with salvaged materials and an unshakable resolve. So the next time you hear a truly unconventional idea, one that seems to defy all common sense, perhaps remember the quiet Swede in the Alaskan Valley. Remember the mockery he endured, and the ultimate, undeniable vindication written in the warmth of his home and the safety of his family. If this story changed how you think about the power of a single, well-reasoned idea, hit that like button and subscribe for more Forgotten Frontier wisdom. What's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? Drop a comment below and share your story. The narrative you have just heard is a fictionalized account created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering principles of geothermal air tempering, super insulation, and airtight construction are real and historically practiced in various forms, the specific characters, names, and events depicted in this story are products of imagination. This content is not intended to serve as architectural or engineering advice.